The morning drums stopped beating when they dragged the bodies from Genghis Khan's private tent. Dawn light filtered through the felt walls of the great ordo, catching dust motes that swirled above 500 sleeping women. Guards stood frozen at their posts, leather armor creaking as they turned to watch. The Khan emerged first, his shadow falling across frost-covered grass. Behind him, two figures stumbled into daylight. A young wife from the western tribes, barely 16 winters old, one of his most trusted generals, a man who'd ridden with him since the unification wars, their wrists bound with horsehair rope, the traditional binding for those who'd broken the ultimate law. The executioner's stake already stood ready in the center of camp. It always did. Genghis Khan's voice carried across the silent encampment, each word measured and cold. The Yasa is absolute, for all people, in all circumstances. The assembled warriors lowered their eyes. Even battle-hardened men who'd seen cities burn couldn't meet their leader's gaze this morning. The girls' sobs echoed off the mountains. The general said nothing. Both knew their fate had been sealed the moment guards discovered them together, in the darkness before dawn. No trial needed. No mercy possible, the law was the law. This was year 20 of Genghis Khan's reign. By sunrise, 2 more bodies would join the hundreds who'd learned that in the Khan's world, control was everything, and everything was controlled. How does a man who united scattered tribes through brilliance and brutality transform into someone who murders his own people for love? You need to understand the journey from a boy named Temujin, kidnapped and abandoned, to the Khan who just ordered those executions. The path leads through 4 massive tent cities, hundreds of captured women, and a secret law code that turned intimacy itself into a weapon of control. Everything started with a girl named Berta and a promise made in blood. The feast tent fell silent except for the sound of Temujin's father gasping for air. Holan watched her husband's face turn purple, his hands clawing at his throat while Tatars smiled around their fire. 9-year-old Temujin sat frozen as foam bubbled from his father's lips. The boy who would one day execute lovers at dawn first learned about betrayal while watching his own father die from poisoned mutton. Within days, their world collapsed completely. The same families who'd sworn loyalty to Yasuge abandoned his widow and children on the open steppe. Holan's screams echoed across empty grassland as former allies rode away with the family's horses, leaving 7 children to starve. Temujin dug wild roots from frozen ground, while his baby sister cried for milk their mother couldn't produce. Survival meant eating field mice and tree bark. It meant watching his mother prostitute herself for scraps of dried meat from passing traders. The future Khan learned early that promises meant nothing, that loyalty lasted only as long as power did. Each betrayal carved deeper into the boy's understanding of how the world really worked. His half-brother Berta took the largest portions of their meager food, establishing dominance through fists and threats. When Temujin complained to his mother, she slapped him hard across the face. The eldest eats first. That's how it's always been. But something shifted in the boy's eyes that winter night. Spring brought the confrontation everyone knew was coming. Berta had taken the last fish Temujin caught, laughing as the younger boy's stomach growled. The future Khan drew his bow with steady hands, his brother Yasa beside him. Berta saw them approach across the hillside but didn't run. Perhaps he thought they were still children playing at war. The arrow struck him in the back, puncturing through to his chest. Berta fell to his knees, blood spreading across new grass while his killers watched. No emotion crossed Temujin's face as his half-brother died. This was simply the restoration of order, the correction of an imbalance that threatened their survival. Holan beat her sons bloody when they returned to camp, cursing them as murderers and kinslayers. But Temujin had discovered something fundamental about himself. Control brought peace. Chaos brought suffering. If maintaining order required violence, then violence became another tool, like hunting or building shelter. The Taichiud clan arrived next, led by warriors who claimed Temujin's father owed them horses. They found a teenager already hardened by loss, already learning to trust no one. Iron shackles closed around his wrists as they dragged him from his family's camp. His mother's wails faded into distance as horses carried him toward slavery. Months in captivity taught him about systematic control. The Taichiud kept him in a wooden collar called a kangwu, parading him through camps as an example. He memorized every guard's routine, every weakness in their watch patterns. The boy who killed his brother for stealing food now studied his captors with predators' patience. His escape came during a feast when guards drank themselves stupid on fermented mare's milk. Temujin slipped his bonds and vanished into darkness, the kangoo still locked around his neck. He hid neck-deep in river water while search parties thundered past, holding his breath each time torches swept the banks. An old man named Sorkin Shearer found him shivering at dawn, the wooden collar cutting bloody grooves in his shoulders. Instead of claiming the reward, Sorkin burned the kangoo and sent Temujin home with a stolen horse. One act of kindness in an ocean of betrayal, filed away for future reference. But home offered no safety. Word spread that the Taichiud's escaped slave had returned. Holan moved their camp constantly, always watching the horizon for dust clouds that meant riders approaching. Temujin practiced archery until his fingers bled, knowing that next time shackles came for him, he'd meet them with arrows. Then came the day that would forge the final piece of his character. Merkid raiders swept down from northern mountains, seeking revenge for an old feud with Temujin's father. The family scattered into tall grass as horsemen circled their camp. Hidden in the reeds, Temujin heard his mother scream as warriors discovered their hiding spot. They took Berta, his young wife of mere months, the girl he'd travelled days to marry, the one person who'd chosen him when he had nothing. Merkid laughter rang across the steppe as they threw her across a saddle. Temujin watched from his hiding place, memorizing each rider's face while his fingers dug into earth. For 3 days he didn't speak. His brothers tried talking to him, but he stared at the horizon where dust had swallowed Berta's captors. Something fundamental had broken inside the young man who'd already lost father, clan, and freedom. The last piece of his humanity, the part that could still trust and love freely, crumbled as he planned his response. He would get her back, not through pleading or negotiation, but through systematic destruction of everyone who'd taken her. Order would be restored, control would be absolute. But when raiders came for the one person he couldn't afford to lose, something inside Temujin snapped forever. The rescue mission began with a blood oath sworn over burning wolf bones. Temujin cut his palm and let drops fall into the flames while speaking ancient words that bound him to recover what was stolen. His blood brother Jamuka arrived with 200 riders, their horses' hooves thundering across frozen ground. Old Tohrul Khan, who owed Temujin's father a debt, brought 10,000 more warriors. The combined force moved like a storm cloud across the steppe. Scouts returned with news that made Temujin's jaw clench. The Merkids had divided Berta and other captives among 3 separate camps, spreading them across valleys to prevent exactly this kind of rescue. His commanders wanted to strike the largest camp first. Temujin overruled them with 4 words that would define his future approach to warfare and control. "We take them all." The attacks came simultaneously at dawn. Temujin led the assault on the eastern camp, where intelligence suggested Berta was held. Merkid sentries died with arrows in their throats before they could sound alarms. The camp erupted in screams as riders swept through felt tents, cutting down anyone who resisted. Through the chaos of burning yurts and fleeing horses, Temujin heard a voice that stopped his heart. Berta's scream rose above the battle sounds, not in fear but in rage. He found her in a supply wagon, using a cooking knife to slash at a Merkid warrior trying to silence her. The man's blood sprayed across her face as Temujin's sword separated his head from his shoulders. She didn't recognize him at first. 8 months of captivity had changed them both. Her eyes held a hardness that matched his own, the innocence of their wedding night replaced by something sharper. When recognition finally came, she collapsed against his chest, her body shaking with sobs that sounded more like growls. "Never again," he whispered into her hair. The words carried weight beyond a simple promise. They became law. The ride back to their camp took 3 days. Berta rode beside him in silence, her swollen belly obvious beneath stolen Merkid robes. Neither spoke about the pregnancy that couldn't possibly be his. The other rescued women whispered behind their hands, but one look from Temujin silenced them. His acceptance of her condition sent a message through the ranks. His woman, his decision, his control. But questions festered like untreated wounds. Warriors who'd fought beside him exchanged glances when Berta's condition became undeniable. Tradition demanded a husband reject a wife who'd been defiled by enemies. Custom required the child be left on the step to die. Temujin shattered both expectations with calculated precision. The child arrived during a spring storm that shook their jur with violent winds. Temujin paced outside while Berta's screams mixed with thunder. His mother, Ho-Lun, emerged hours later carrying a bloody infant. A boy, healthy and strong, with features that could belong to any steppe warrior. "What will you name him?" Ho-Lun asked, watching her son's face for any sign of rejection. "Jochi, the eldest." The name itself was a declaration. This child would inherit as a true son regardless of blood. But even as Temujin held the infant, studying features that might or might not be his, something cold settled in his chest. Doubt was another form of chaos. Uncertainty bred weakness. The first rules came shortly after, simple edicts that seemed reasonable to warriors still celebrating their victory. No man could touch another's wife, even in jest. Women of the camp would sleep in designated areas, watched by guards Temujin personally selected. Any warrior who entered these areas without permission faced immediate execution. His generals accepted these laws as temporary measures, protection for traumatized captives. They didn't see the framework being constructed. Each rule built upon the last, creating walls invisible but absolute. Berta noticed first the way her husband's eyes tracked every man who spoke to her, how his hand tightened on his sword when she laughed at another's joke. "You're building a prison," she told him one night, as baby Jochi slept between them. "I'm building order," he corrected, his voice carrying that new note of iron. "Chaos took you once. Structure will ensure it never happens again." The transformation accelerated after their second son arrived. Chagatai came into the world with Temujin's unmistakable features, erasing any doubt about parentage. But instead of easing his control, having a certain air only intensified it. Now he had bloodlines to protect, legitimacy to maintain, power to consolidate. New laws emerged weekly. Women couldn't leave camp without escort. Marriages required his personal approval. Adultery became punishable by death for both parties. What started as protection evolved into possession, then into something darker that his people didn't yet have words for. Berta watched her husband change from the boy who'd hidden in reeds to a man who demanded absolute obedience. She'd survived Merkid captivity, only to find herself in a different kind of cage. The walls were silk instead of rope, the guards were protectors instead of captors, but freedom had become a memory. Late at night, she sometimes wondered if Temujin's transformation began the day they took her, or if the seeds had been planted earlier, when he'd murdered his half-brother. When the Taichiud locked him in the Kango. When his father died choking on poisoned meat. Each betrayal had carved away pieces of his ability to trust, leaving only the need to control. The other wives began arriving once his power solidified. Political marriages to cement alliances, captured women from defeated tribes, gifts from subordinate chiefs. Each new addition came with expanded rules, stricter protocols. The simple ger where Jochi was born grew into a complex of tents, then into something larger. Berta remained first wife, but the title meant less as the household expanded. She watched Temujin distribute his attention like a general deploying troops, each interaction calculated for maximum control. Love had become another tool in his arsenal, affection rationed out to maintain order. "Remember when you promised I'd never be taken again?" she asked him after the 10th new wife arrived. "You haven't been," he replied without looking up from maps of future conquests. "No one will ever take what's mine." The distinction cut deeper than any blade. She wasn't protected because he loved her. She was protected because she belonged to him. The boy who'd sworn blood oaths to rescue her had become a man who collected women like horses, valuable but ultimately replaceable. Their third son Urgidai arrived amid this growing system of control. Then Tolui. Each birth expanded Temujin's need for order. 4 sons meant 4 potential sources of chaos, 4 bloodlines that could challenge each other. The laws grew more elaborate, governing inheritance, succession, loyalty. But it was Jochi who bore the heaviest burden. The whispers about his parentage never fully died. Temujin's public acceptance couldn't erase private doubts. The boy grew up knowing his every action was scrutinized, his every success questioned. His father's protection came with a price that compounded daily. Years later, when Temujin had become Genghis Khan and the 4 ordos sprawled across conquered territories, Berta would think back to those early days. The pattern had been so clear in retrospect. Each loss of control had triggered tighter restrictions. Each betrayal had birthed new laws. Each moment of chaos had demanded greater order. She'd been the first, the catalyst that transformed a traumatized young warrior into an emperor who would murder lovers at dawn. Her kidnapping hadn't just stolen 8 months of her life. It had broken something fundamental in the man who loved her, replacing trust with possession, replacing protection with control. The question of Jochi's parentage would haunt their family for generations, but it gave birth to something far more terrifying than doubts about bloodlines. It created a man who would write laws in secret, build cities of women, and turn intimacy itself into a battlefield where he could never lose control again. The whispered words spread through Temujin's camp like plague. Warriors huddled around dying fires, passing along memorized fragments of laws their leader scratched onto birch bark in his private gear. No one dared speak them aloud during daylight. These weren't proclamations announced with drums and ceremony. They emerged from shadows, carried by trusted men who'd proven their loyalty through blood. The first executions came without warning. A young warrior named Belgute had shared his tent with another man's wife, while her husband rode on a scouting mission. Dawn brought the sound of stakes being hammered into frozen ground. Belgute's screams lasted until noon, echoing off mountain walls while his lover suffocated beside him, her mouth packed with dirt to muffle her cries. Temujin watched from horseback, his face carved from stone. "The law is the law," he announced to assembled warriors. No one asked which law. No one had seen it written. They only knew that chaos had touched their leader once, stolen what was his, and now order would be maintained through terror. More rules emerged weekly, each more severe than the last. A man who looked too long at another's wife lost his eyes. A woman who met privately with any man not her husband faced the stake. Guards reported conversations, tracked movements, memorized patterns. The camp transformed from a military unit into something else entirely, a community where every glance carried potential death. Temujin's inner circle received the full code first, written in his own hand on scraped hide. They read it by firelight while he watched their faces for any sign of weakness or doubt. The section on women ran longer than all military regulations combined. Who could marry whom? When conjugal visits were permitted? Which punishments fit which violations? His generals' hands shook as they memorized statutes that would govern the most intimate moments of their lives. Jamuka voiced what others only thought. "These laws will destroy us from within. Warriors need freedom too." The sentence died as Temujin's blade touched his throat. "Warriors need order. I've seen what happens without it. I've paid the price of chaos." His voice carried memories of Berta's swollen belly, of doubts that would never fully die. "My people will know certainty." The code grew with each conquest, each betrayal, each moment that threatened Temujin's grip on his expanding world. A captured Chinese scribe taught him proper writing, and suddenly the whispered laws became permanent, carved into wooden tablets that traveled in locked boxes. Scholars would later call this collection the Yasa, the supreme law, but in those early years, warriors simply called them the silent rules, regulations that governed life and demanded death. Women felt the weight first and heaviest. The old steppe freedom where wives could divorce husbands, where widows chose new mates, where daughters rode alongside sons, crumbled under paragraphs of restrictions. Temujin appointed female guards not to protect but to watch. They reported conversations, monitored friendships, tracked monthly cycles with disturbing precision. His mother Holun watched her son's transformation with growing horror. The boy she'd raised on roots and bark now commanded thousands, but each victory brought new paranoia, fresh laws, tighter control. She found him one night writing by candlelight, his script flowing across hide in neat rows. "What drives this?" She gestured at stacks of completed statutes. "Your father never needed written laws. The old ways. The old ways let them take her. His stylus never paused. The old ways left us starving. The old ways are dead." Holun studied her son's face, searching for traces of the child who'd once played in tall grass. She found only an architect of order, building walls from words and consequences. "You're creating something monstrous." "I'm creating something permanent." He set down his stylus and met her eyes. "My sons will inherit an empire where the rules are absolute, where no one questions bloodlines because questioning means death, where women are protected because touching them means execution, where chaos can never take root because I've burned away the soil it needs to grow." The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered the kidnapping. Temujin had rescued Berta from captivity only to imprison every woman who followed. His trauma had metastasized into law, spreading through his growing nation like a disease that presented as cure. Young warriors learned the marriage sections through bloody example. A promising captain named Subedete requested permission to wed a girl from a conquered tribe. He followed protocols perfectly, submitted written requests, waited for approval. The ceremony proceeded according to the Yasa's requirements. Guards verified the bride's virginity. Witnesses confirmed consent. Every detail aligned with written law. 3 days later, Subedete discovered his new wife meeting secretly with her former betrothed, a prisoner working in the horse herds. They'd only talked, sharing memories of their scattered tribe. But the Yasa made no distinctions. Private meetings equaled adultery, equaled death. Subedete himself delivered them to Temujin, knowing that any hesitation would mark him as weak. He watched his wife die at dawn, her former lover beside her, while the law he'd followed so carefully demanded their blood. The lesson spread through the ranks faster than any spoken command. The Yasa wasn't just about punishment. It was about complicity, forcing every man to become an enforcer, every woman a prisoner of protection. The code's influence reached beyond marriage and sexuality. Property laws, inheritance structures, military regulations, all flowed from Temujin's need to eliminate uncertainty. But it was the intimate statutes that cut deepest, that transformed daily life into a careful dance around invisible lines that could kill. A warrior's wife couldn't leave her jur after sunset without written permission. Women traveled in groups of 3 or more, never pairs, never alone. Widows remarried according to strict hierarchies that preserved bloodlines and prevented claims. Children belonged to their fathers absolutely, regardless of maternal wishes. Each rule solved a potential source of chaos by crushing human connections that might threaten order. The Yasa even governed emotions. Public displays of affection between spouses drew punishment. Excessive grief at a husband's death suggested improper attachment. Laughing too freely, dressing too beautifully, speaking too confidently, all became crimes that started with warnings and escalated to death. The code didn't just control bodies. It sought to regulate souls. Some warriors fled rather than submit, taking their families into the vast steppe, where Temujin's reach hadn't yet extended. They became warnings for those who remained. Hunting parties would return with heads mounted on spears, deserters who'd learned that the Yasa's reach exceeded its written borders. Their wives and daughters joined the growing camps of women that followed Temujin's army, absorbed into a system they died trying to escape. Religious leaders found themselves bound by new restrictions. Shamans who'd once moved freely between camps now needed permits. Buddhist monks discovered their vows of celibacy, subject to verification. Islamic teachers learned that their marriage laws bowed to the Yasa's requirements. Temujin didn't care which god men prayed to, as long as they obeyed his earthly rules. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the code's brutality, but its comprehensiveness. Previous rulers had executed adulterers or punished theft. But Temujin's Yasa reached into every corner of existence, governing not just actions but intentions, not just crimes but possibilities. It created a society where love itself became dangerous, where natural human connections carried the seed of capital punishment. His own sons learned this through painful experience. Young Chagatai fell in love with a commander's daughter, composing poems that praised her beauty. The verses reached Temujin's ears through the network of informants that honeyed through his camp. That night, Chagatai woke to find his father standing over his bed. "Love makes men weak," Temujin informed his son. "Weak men make poor leaders invite chaos." The girl disappeared the next morning, sent to distant relatives beyond the frontier. Chagatai never wrote another poem. The lesson carved itself into the next generation's bones. Even the Khan's blood offered no protection from the Yasa's demands. By the time Temujin had united the tribes and taken the title Genghis Khan, his legal code had grown into volumes that required dedicated scholars to interpret. But at its heart remained those first whispered laws born from trauma and loss. Every statute traced back to that moment when Merkid raiders had shattered his ability to trust in anything but absolute control. The Yasa would eventually govern the largest land empire in human history. Millions would live and die by its statutes. Entire civilizations would bend or break against its requirements. But it began with a young man writing by candlelight, transforming personal pain into universal law, building a world where no one could ever take what was his again. These laws would soon apply to everyone, but first he needed an empire large enough to enforce them. The herald's voice cracked as he read surrender terms to the assembled crowd. Each family will present one daughter to the Khan's representatives. These women will serve as bonds of peace between our peoples. Behind him, Temujin's warriors formed perfect lines, their armor reflecting afternoon sun, while mothers clutched their daughters close. The mathematics were simple. Every conquered tribe meant more wives. Every alliance required marriages. Every victory brought human tribute wrapped in silk and ceremony. Temujin watched from his command tent as defeated chiefs lined up their female relatives like horses at market. The girls ranged from 12 to 20, each one representing a calculation of control. A Naiman princess stumbled forward first, gold ornaments jingling with each reluctant step. Her father had commanded 10,000 warriors just yesterday. Now he knelt in mud, offering his daughter to save what remained of his people. Temujin's secretary recorded her name on birch bark, adding her to lists that grew longer with each campaign. "She's beautiful," one of his generals murmured. "She'll make a fine addition too." The sentence ended with a wet gasp. Temujin's knife had opened the man's throat before anyone saw him move. Blood sprayed across the surrender documents while the general collapsed, his hands clutching at a wound that would never close. The message rippled through both armies. These weren't women anymore. They were property of the Khan, and property stayed untouched. The Naiman princess froze mid-step, her silk robes now spattered with arterial spray. Behind her, the other tribute daughters huddled together, suddenly understanding their new reality. They weren't entering marriages. They were becoming possessions in a collection that already numbered in dozens. Temujin wiped his blade clean on the dead general's coat. "Continue the ceremony." His voice carried that particular tone that made brave men remember urgent business elsewhere. The herald resumed reading terms with shaking hands while assistants dragged the corpse away. Each girl who stepped forward now understood the price of being chosen. They would live in luxury. They would bear royal children. They would also exist inside walls built from blood and silence. The logistics challenged even Temujin's organizational genius. 20 new wives from this victory alone, 30 from the previous campaign. The small circle of Jers that had sheltered Berta now sprawled across valleys, a mobile city dedicated to housing his growing collection. Each wife needed guards, servants, separate quarters. Each one represented not just a person but an entire support system that moved with his armies. Supply lines that should carry weapons and food increasingly hauled silk, jewelry, and the 1,000 small luxuries that kept captive princesses from open rebellion. His quartermasters learned to factor human cargo into every calculation. How many extra horses for the women's carriages? How much additional food for their servants? Where would they camp when the army needed to move quickly? The answers came through trial and fatal error. During the Taichud campaign, several wives had fallen behind during a forced march. Temujin's response defined expectations forever. He executed the guards who'd allowed the delay, then the servants who'd packed too slowly, then the stable hands who'd failed to prepare adequate horses. The message burned itself into institutional memory. The Khan's women moved with the same priority as his weapons. But movement was only part of the challenge. Housing presented complexities that would have broken lesser administrators. Each wife required separate quarters to prevent the jealousies and alliances that could threaten order. Berta, as first wife, commanded the central ger, but even her position came with careful boundaries. The other women orbited her authority like planets around a sun, close enough to show respect but far enough to prevent conspiracy. The Kerit princesses occupied the eastern section, their gers arranged by age and status. Naiman wives filled the western quarter, carefully separated from their traditional enemies among the Taichud women to the north. Southern quarters housed the daughters of various smaller tribes, the organizational chart of their placement requiring dedicated scribes to track. Guards patrolled boundaries between sections with the same vigilance they'd show on battlefield perimeters. Women could visit other quarters only with written permission, their movements tracked and reported. The simple act of sharing tea became a political maneuver requiring approval from 3 different administrators. Food distribution followed military precision. Each wife received rations based on rank, fertility, and current favor. Pregnant women earned double portions. Those who'd borne sons ate better than those who'd produced only daughters. New additions started with basic allowances that could increase or decrease based on behavior and compliance. The system created its own ecosystem of competition and control. Wives vied for resources through the only currency Temujin recognized: absolute obedience to his growing body of laws. A Merkit princess who memorized and followed every statute might earn silk robes and better meat. A Tatar daughter who whispered complaints would find her rations cut and her servants reassigned. Children complicated the mathematics exponentially. Each wife who produced offspring required wet nurses, tutors, expanded quarters. The camp's edges filled with the sounds of babies crying in different languages, their mothers singing lullabies from scattered tribes. Temujin insisted on central education for all his children, creating schools where the sons and daughters of enemies learned together under careful supervision. His legitimate sons with Berta held special status, but dozens of half-siblings crowded their world. The boys trained together in archery and riding, their competitions carefully monitored to prevent fatal accidents. The girls learned weaving and household management, their instructors reporting any signs of unusual intelligence or ambition that might require management. Medical care presented unique challenges. Each tribe brought different healing traditions, different concepts of childbirth and illness. Shamans from conquered peoples found themselves working alongside Chinese physicians and Islamic healers, all supervised by Temujin's personal doctors, who ensured no treatment could be used for poison or abortion. The death of a wife created administrative nightmares. Her servants faced immediate reassignment or execution, depending on circumstances. Her quarters required cleansing and redistribution. Her children, if any, needed new guardians aligned with Temujin's interests. Even grief became regulated, with mourning periods defined by statute and excessive sorrow punished as disruptive to order. Communication between wives followed channels as rigid as military intelligence. Direct meetings required approval. Letters passed through censors who checked for coded messages or complaints. Even casual conversation during communal meals faced scrutiny from listeners who reported suspicious topics or dangerous friendships. The economic burden grew with each conquest. Traditional Mongol armies traveled light, living off the land and moving like wind across grass. But Temujin's mobile city of women required supply trains that stretched for miles. Merchants learned to follow his campaigns, knowing that victory meant new customers with bottomless appetites for luxury goods. Chinese silk traders competed with Persian jewelers for access to the Khan's growing household. Each new wife meant potential profits, but also potential death if their goods enabled any breach of security. A merchant who sold a Tangut princess writing materials faced execution when she used them to attempt communication with her distant family. The message spread through trading networks. Profit came with mortal risks. Military campaigns increasingly factored in the women's needs. Scouts reported not just on enemy positions but on local resources that could supply the mobile household. Would conquered territories provide adequate fabric for clothing? Could local craftsmen create the furnishings each new wife would require? Did the region have enough livestock to feed an exponentially growing population? Some generals grumbled about the logistical burden, comparing their supply challenges to those of armies half their size. They learned to keep such thoughts private after Temujin executed a commander who'd suggested leaving the women behind during a rapid advance. The Khan's response was recorded for posterity. My women are not burdens, they are the foundation of empire. Each one represents a tribe that cannot rebel while their daughters live in my gers. The truth was more complex than simple hostage-taking. Each wife created webs of connection and control that bound conquered peoples tighter than any chain. A Naiman chief might consider rebellion until he remembered his daughter's children carried Temujin's blood. A Kerit warrior might dream of revenge until he calculated how many relatives now lived within the Khan's mobile city. Marriage became mathematics, and mathematics became empire. Each woman added to the collection represented thousands of warriors who now had personal stakes in Temujin's continued success. Their daughters' lives depended on stability. Their grandchildren's futures required the empire's expansion. Rebellion meant not just military defeat, but the execution of family members who'd become involuntary guarantors of peace. The system fed itself through success. Each victory brought new wives. New wives required larger organizations. Larger organizations needed more conquests to sustain them. The boy who'd rescued one woman from kidnappers now commanded a human collection that would have staggered the imagination of any previous steppe leader. By the time he'd consolidated control over the majority of Mongol tribes, managing this household had evolved beyond simple military administration. It required its own command structure, its own supply chains, its own legal codes. The general who'd once planned cavalry charges now spent hours reviewing housing arrangements and food distribution for hundreds of women and their offspring. The transformation was nearly complete. The traumatized youth who'd hidden in reeds while enemies took his bride had become a systematic collector of human beings. Each addition to his household represented another calculation in his quest for absolute control, another brick in walls built from flesh and marriage contracts. By the time he controlled most of Mongolia, managing his wives had become a military operation unto itself, requiring the same strategic planning as conquering kingdoms. Guards' boots crunched across frozen grass in perfect synchronization. 400 men moved as one organism through the darkness, their leather armor whispering secrets to the wind. At the center of their formation, a single felt-covered cart rolled forward on wooden wheels that someone had wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The nightly ritual had begun. Torches flickered at predetermined intervals around the vast encampment. Not random placement but careful calculation, each flame positioned to eliminate shadows where danger might hide. Women peered through gaps in their jur walls, counting heartbeats until the procession passed. They knew better than to step outside during the ceremony that determined where their lord would spend his night. Inside the cart, Genghis Khan studied reports by candlelight while his mobile fortress transported him between the 4 distinct cities that comprised his domestic empire. His finger traced supply lists and breeding records with the same intensity he once reserved for battle plans. A scribe huddled in the corner, recording which wife had last borne a son, which princess had shown signs of rebellion, which quarters needed additional guards after last week's incident. The cart rolled to a stop outside the eastern section, Berta's domain. 500 gers spread in concentric circles around her central pavilion, each ring representing different levels of status and favor. The outermost tents sheltered the newest additions, girls still learning the rhythms of their captivity. Closer rings held established wives who'd proven their compliance through years of careful obedience. The great Khan emerged from his transport like a general inspecting fortifications. His guard captain whispered updates as they walked. 2 women in the 3rd ring had been caught exchanging messages. A Kerit princess in the 5th ring was pregnant again. The Naiman wives had requested additional fabric for winter clothing. Each detail mattered because chaos lived in overlooked corners. Berta waited at her threshold, grey threading through hair that had once shone like polished obsidian. 23 years had passed since her rescue, but her eyes still carried memories of 8 months in Merkid hands. She bowed with practiced precision, neither too deep nor too shallow. Even the first wife lived within boundaries defined by law and precedent. The Western camp reports shortages, she informed her husband as he entered. No greeting, no warmth, just administrative efficiency. 3 guards fell sick after eating spoiled meat. I've had their replacements drawn from the reserve units. Behind her, a dozen women moved through the great Gur's interior, preparing sleeping quarters and heating wine. Each one represented a different conquered tribe, their presence both practical and symbolic. The Khan's household staff mirrored his empire, diverse peoples united under singular control. He settled onto cushions while Berta continued her report. Population numbers, supply requirements, pregnancy confirmations, death notifications. The machinery of managing 500 women required constant maintenance. A successful birth here, a miscarriage there, each event rippling through careful calculations of resources and attention. The Tangut girls in Section 4 have adapted well, she noted, consulting hide scrolls covered in neat script. But the new Uyghur princess refuses to eat. 3rd day now. The Khan's expression never changed. Hunger strikes were their own form of rebellion, as dangerous as any armed uprising. Double her guards. When she weakens enough, feed her by force. Document everything. A young servant accidentally dropped a bronze cup. The clang echoed through the Gur like a death knell. Everyone froze. The girl's face drained of color as she realized her error. Disrupting the Khan's evening visit meant consequences that started with beating and escalated from there. Continue, Genghis Khan said simply. The servant girl nearly collapsed with relief as she scrambled to retrieve the cup. Berta resumed her recitation without acknowledging the interruption. They'd learned long ago that drawing attention to mistakes only magnified disorder. Outside, the guard rotation was changing shifts. Fresh warriors replaced those who'd stood motionless for hours, their discipline absolute. Each man knew that protecting the Khan's women meant more than preventing escape. It meant maintaining the delicate ecosystem of control that kept 500 potentially hostile women from becoming 500 sources of chaos. The night sounds of the camp created their own symphony. Babies crying in distant jers, horses snorting in their paddocks, the soft murmur of women singing lullabies in 20 different languages, and underneath it all, the steady tramp of boots as patrols circled endlessly through the darkness. The Khitan section needs expansion, Berta continued. 4 more pregnancies confirmed this month. At current rates, we'll require 12 additional jers by spring. Mathematics of empire, calculated in wombs and cradles. Each child born added complexity to an already staggering system. Wet nurses, tutors, guards, supplies, all multiplying with every successful birth. The army that conquered nations struggled to manage the consequences of its own success. A commotion erupted somewhere in the outer rings, shouting voices quickly suppressed. The Khan's ear tilted slightly, tracking the disturbance without turning his head. Within moments, a guard captain appeared at the entrance, bowing low. A woman in Section 7 attempted to climb the palisade. She's been restrained. Which woman? The Jin princess taken last month, the one who claimed to be a concubine rather than daughter. Lies were another form of disorder. Women who misrepresented their status to avoid joining the collection threatened the careful hierarchies that maintained peace. If one could lie about her origins, others might try. Small deceptions grew into large rebellions if left unchecked. Tomorrow at dawn, the Khan decided. Public punishment, 20 lashes. Let the others see what deception brings. The captain bowed and disappeared. Berta made a notation on her scroll. Another event to track, another lesson to coordinate. The administration of fear required the same precision as the distribution of food. Too little and rebellion festered. Too much and desperation made women unpredictable. Your sons visited today, Berta mentioned, her voice carefully neutral. The topic of children always carried weight, especially when discussing the 4 boys whose legitimacy would shape the empire's future. Jochi brought gifts for his new half-sister. Chagatai complained about the noise from the children's quarters disturbing his weapons practice. Each son reflected a different aspect of their father's nature. Jochi, forever marked by questions of paternity, tried to purchase acceptance through generosity. Chagatai, secure in his bloodline, demanded the world reshape itself around his needs. Ogedai played politics with wine and jokes. Tolui studied everything with eyes that missed nothing. They'll need to learn management, Genghis Khan observed. Each will inherit a portion of this along with territories. The thought of dividing 500 women among 4 sons created its own complexities. Would they maintain unified control or establish separate systems? Would the carefully balanced ethnicities hold together or fragment along inheritance lines? Questions that would only find answers after their father's death. The Kheshig guard changed positions outside, a choreographed dance of protection that never ceased. Elite warriors who'd proven themselves in battle now spent their nights counting pregnant women and tracking menstrual cycles. Their skills at killing redirected toward maintaining life under absolute control. The new girls need orientation, Berta noted. 16 arrived yesterday from the Jin territories. Most are young, terrified. The standard introduction should help them adjust. Standard introduction, a bureaucratic term for the systematic breaking of spirits. New wives learned the rules through careful combination of luxury and restriction. Silk robes and golden ornaments arrived alongside lists of regulations. Servants attended their needs, while guards marked their boundaries. Comfort and captivity intertwined until women couldn't separate one from the other. The Khan rose, signaling the evening's end. He'd visit the southern section next, then the western quarters, finally the northern camp before dawn. 4 ordos, 4 principal wives managing their sections, 4 separate worlds united under his singular authority. Each visit reinforced control, reminded subordinates of their place, maintained the careful balance that prevented chaos. The Karaite princess in Section 2 has requested an audience, Berta mentioned as he moved toward the exit. She claims to have information about plots among the newer wives. Information or manipulation? In the Khan's world, both served purposes. Wives who reported on each other created networks of mistrust that prevented unified rebellion. But wives who lied to gain favor threatened the system's integrity. Each accusation required investigation, verification, consequences. Send her to the morning tribunal. I'll hear her then. The guards formed around him as he left Berta's ger. His mobile fortress waited, ready to transport him to the next section of his domestic empire. 4 camps, 500 women, thousands of children, tens of thousands of guards and servants, all flowing from one man's need to ensure that chaos could never again steal what belonged to him. The cart began rolling toward the southern section. Inside, the Khan returned to his scrolls and calculations. Supply lines, pregnancy rates, punishment schedules. The same mind that had revolutionized steppe warfare now applied itself to managing the consequences of conquest. Each number represented a person, but people were just another resource to be controlled. As the procession moved through darkness, women in their gers counted the moments until it passed. Some prayed to forget they'd ever known freedom. Others dreamed of homes they'd never see again. A few plotted impossible escapes. But all understood the fundamental truth of their existence. They lived within walls built from law and fear, serving a man who'd transformed personal trauma into systematic oppression. This wasn't just organization, it was preparation for something his sons would inherit, a system of control so absolute that it would outlive its creator and shape the fates of nations yet unconquered. The ceremony unfolded with military precision. A Tatar widow stood before her dead husband's eldest son, while scribes recorded every detail on fresh bark. The young man's voice carried across the assembled families as he declared his intentions. His father's 3 wives would pass to him according to ancient custom and new law. All except his birth mother, who watched from designated mourners' quarters, her face carved from stone. The Khan's legal code had transformed an old tradition into something far more systematic. Levirate marriage once served practical purposes on the harsh steppe. Widows needed protection. Children required providers. Bloodlines demanded preservation. Simple survival mathematics that kept families intact when death claimed warriors in their prime. Now those same customs became tools of empire. Every succession followed written protocols that would have baffled previous generations. The eldest son inherited his father's wives, but documentation tracked each transfer. Guards verified consent that everyone understood was purely ceremonial. Scribes noted which women moved between tents, creating genealogies that stretched across conquered territories. The Tatar son completed his declarations while his new wives lined up behind him, the youngest barely 16 summers, the oldest approaching 40 winters. Their eyes stayed fixed on the ground as custom demanded. Behind them, children watched their mothers become stepmothers through bureaucratic alchemy that cared nothing for emotional bonds. Each transfer sent ripples through the camp's careful hierarchies. A wife who'd commanded respect under her first husband might find herself diminished under his son's authority. Age gaps that spanned decades created household tensions no amount of law could fully suppress. Young men inherited women who'd known them as infants, creating dynamics that poisoned daily interactions. Genghis Khan observed these ceremonies personally when they involved prominent families. His presence reminded everyone that these transfers weren't just tradition but law, violations of which carried consequences written in blood. A son who rejected his father's wives insulted the dead and threatened the system's integrity. A widow who refused her assigned protector challenged the order that kept chaos at bay. The mathematics grew more complex with each generation. A successful warrior might accumulate a dozen wives through conquest and alliance. His death created an inheritance puzzle that lesser minds couldn't solve. Did all wives go to the eldest son? Could younger brothers claim shares? What happened when sons from different mothers competed for the same women? The Yasa provided answers with typical brutal clarity. Eldest sons held primary claims, but younger brothers could petition for specific wives based on household needs. No woman could remain unmarried. No household could harbor unattached females. The law closed every loophole that might allow independence or create uncertainty about control. Real tragedy lived in the children who watched these transfers. A boy might see his mother pass to his half-brother like livestock at market. Girls observed their futures, written in their mother's fates, understanding they too would someday stand in similar lines. The system perpetuated itself through witnessed trauma that normalized what previous generations would have considered abomination. Disputes arose despite the clear regulations. 2 brothers might claim the same favored wife, each citing different provisions of inheritance law. A widow might carry another man's child, complicating bloodline calculations. Young wives sometimes formed bonds with their husband's sons before his death, creating emotional tangles that threatened household stability. The Khan's tribunals handled such cases with precedents that became their own body of law. A pregnant widow went to whoever would claim the child. Brothers who couldn't agree lost all rights while the woman went to a neutral third party. Emotional attachments meant nothing against written statute. The system ground forward, crushing individual desires beneath administrative necessity. Some women adapted by becoming experts in succession law. They cultivated relationships with multiple sons, hedging against uncertain futures. Others hoarded resources that might ease transitions between households. The smartest ones bore children quickly, knowing that mothers of sons earned marginally better treatment than barren wives or mothers of mere daughters. A Jinn princess mastered the system so completely that she effectively chose her inheritor. Through careful manipulation of household dynamics, she engineered conflicts between her husband's sons until only her preferred candidate remained viable. The Khan's administrators studied her methods, updating regulations to prevent such agency in future successions. The practice created its own economy. Younger sons who inherited valuable wives could trade them for political advantage. A widow with connections to her birth tribe might be worth horses or warriors to the right recipient. Women became currency in transactions that bound families together through shared ownership of human beings. Guards tracked every transfer with the same precision they applied to military supplies. A wife who moved between camps required escorts, documentation, verification at both ends. Her possessions, children, and servants created logistical challenges that multiplied with each reassignment. The simple act of inheritance might involve moving entire households across hostile territory. Cultural differences complicated matters further. Chinese wives expected different treatment than Mongol women. Islamic traditions clashed with steppe customs. Each ethnic group within the Khan's collection brought expectations that the Yasa overruled, but couldn't entirely erase. Inheritance ceremonies became battlegrounds between tradition and law. The most disturbing cases involved very young inheritors. Boys of 12 or 13 suddenly acquired their father's households, including women old enough to be their grandmothers. The law made no age exceptions. If the eldest son could ride and draw a bow, he could inherit wives. These child lords struggled to maintain authority over women who'd lived full lives before they were born. Mongol tradition had always included some form of wife inheritance, but the Khan's system transformed it into something unrecognizable. What once helped families survive became a tool for binding conquered peoples. Every widow who passed to her stepson created new chains of obligation and control that stretched across generations. The psychological toll showed in rising suicide rates among inherited wives. Women who'd endured capture and forced marriage sometimes broke when faced with transfer to their stepsons. The Khan's response was typically practical. Suicide became a crime against the husband's family, punishable by confiscation of the woman's birth family's property. Even death offered no escape from the system. A woman who died between husbands created administrative crises. Her children needed guardians. Her property required distribution. Her servants faced reassignment or execution. Death itself became another transaction requiring documentation and approval. The practice reached its most grotesque extremes in prominent families. When Genghis Khan's own brother died, his wives faced the same inheritance procedures as any common warrior's household. The Khan's nephew stood before his uncle's administrators, formally claiming women who'd shared his childhood meals. The ceremony proceeded with identical precision, whether involving royalty or herdsmen. Exceptions existed but remained vanishingly rare. A wife who'd borne many sons might petition for assignment to one of them rather than her stepson. Women with valuable skills sometimes negotiated positions as household administrators rather than inherited wives, but these cases required navigating bureaucracies that discouraged special treatment. The records survived in meticulous detail. Thousands of transfers documented on hide and bark, creating genealogies that tracked human property across decades. Modern historians would study these documents with fascination and horror, tracing how systematic oppression became normalized through repetition and law. By the empire's height, the practice had spread beyond Mongol territories. Conquered peoples found their own inheritance customs rewritten to match the Khan's requirements. Local traditions bent or broke against Yasa mandates. What started as one man's need for control became universal law across the largest contiguous empire in human history. The system's greatest cruelty lay in its efficiency. Unlike random violence or arbitrary oppression, the inheritance laws operated with clockwork precision. Every widow knew her fate before her husband's body cooled. Every son understood his future responsibilities from childhood. Certainty replaced hope, law replaced chance, and women passed between generations like any other inherited property. But controlling the living wasn't enough. He needed to control his legacy from beyond the grave. The laboratory technician dropped her coffee cup when the results appeared on screen. 16 million living descendants. The ceramic shattered against linoleum while she rechecked the data, certain the computer had malfunctioned, but the genetic markers told the same story across every sample. From Beijing to Warsaw, from Tehran to Moscow, the Y chromosome signature appeared with clockwork regularity. One man's DNA threading through 8% of men across the former Mongol Empire. The numbers defied comprehension until you understood the system behind them. Professor Zergel's team at Oxford published their findings in 2003, but the implications took years to fully grasp. Statistical models suggested this genetic father lived approximately 1,000 years ago. Historical records pointed to only one candidate who combined the timeline, geography, and opportunity. The computers confirmed what the Yasa had engineered centuries before modern science existed. 500 official wives represented just the documented fraction. Guards recorded legitimate marriages, tracked noble bloodlines, monitored pregnancies among women whose names survived in administrative scrolls. But the empire's expansion created opportunities beyond formal documentation. Every conquered city, every shattered defense, every negotiated surrender included unrecorded human tributes. Conservative estimates suggested 2,000 women passed through the Khan's control during his lifetime. Some historians argued for higher numbers, pointing to gaps in records, destroyed documents, oral traditions that spoke of harems stretching beyond any single man's ability to visit. The four ordos represented just the permanent establishments. Mobile camps, temporary victories, and political negotiations created their own ecosystems of controlled reproduction. The mathematics of biology met the efficiency of empire. A healthy man in his prime could father a child every few days given sufficient partners. Multiply that capacity across 4 decades of conquest, add systematic organization that tracked fertility cycles and maximized reproductive opportunities, and the numbers began making terrible sense. The Yasa didn't just control women, it engineered a breeding program that would echo through millennia. His sons inherited both the system and the genetic imperative. Jochi, despite questions about his paternity, fathered dozens of children across his assigned territories. Chagatai's descendants ruled Central Asia for centuries. Ogedai's fertility matched his appetite for wine. Tolui's bloodline would produce Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. Each son became a genetic amplifier, spreading their father's chromosomes through their own collections of wives. The grandsons continued the pattern with mechanical precision. Administrative records from the Yuan dynasty showed imperial princes maintaining households of 300 women or more. Not for pleasure, though that existed, but for the calculated propagation of bloodlines that carried political legitimacy. Every pregnancy became a political act. Every birth expanded networks of control that bound conquered peoples through shared genetics. Modern geneticists found the markers everywhere they looked. The Hazara people of Afghanistan, with their distinctive Asian features amid Central Asian populations, carried the highest concentrations. Genetic analysis confirmed oral traditions that claimed direct descent from Mongol garrisons. Their DNA told stories that historical records had lost or destroyed. But individual populations represented only fragments of the larger pattern. The Y chromosome signature appeared in Russian nobles who'd never suspected Asian ancestry. It surfaced in Persian merchants, Chinese farmers, Eastern European Jews. The genetic river flowed through social classes and ethnic boundaries, carried by centuries of migration, intermarriage, and forgotten connections. Scientists refined their estimates with each technological advance. Early studies suggested 8% of men in the former empire's territories. Updated analysis pushed the numbers higher. 16 million direct male-line descendants represented only those carrying the Y chromosome. Add female descendants, whose mitochondrial DNA told different stories, and the numbers doubled, tripled, expanded beyond meaningful comprehension. The discovery shattered comfortable assumptions about historical irrelevance. Events from 8 centuries ago lived in the cells of modern humans who'd never heard of the Yasa, never learned about systematic wife collection, never imagined their genetic heritage traced to calculated breeding programs. Corporate executives in Tokyo shared chromosomes with taxi drivers in Tehran, their connection written in acids and proteins. Some descendants embraced the discovery with pride, claiming connection to historical greatness. Tourism companies in Mongolia offered genetic testing packages, promising to reveal noble heritage to wealthy foreigners. Politicians in Central Asia invoked genetic studies to support territorial claims. The dead Khan's DNA became currency in modern identity politics. Others recoiled from the implications. Women's rights activists pointed out that 16 million descendants meant millions of historical rapes, forced marriages, and systematic oppression. Each genetic success story represented uncounted human tragedies. The celebrated fertility came from industrial-scale sexual violence wrapped in legal procedure. Genetic counselors faced unique challenges in regions with high marker concentrations. Couples seeking testing sometimes discovered shared ancestry that complicated marriage plans. Traditional prohibitions against cousin marriage collided with genetic realities where entire populations shared common descent. The Khan's legacy created modern ethical dilemmas no one had anticipated. The most disturbing calculations came from demographic modeling. If 16 million men carried direct patrilineal descent, the total number of descendants through all lines might approach 500 million humans. Exponential growth across 30 generations meant that Genghis Khan's genetic legacy touched significant percentages of the entire human species. His DNA achieved what his armies couldn't, conquering not through violence, but through volume. Historians revisited administrative records with new understanding. Those meticulous lists of wives, pregnancies, and births represented history's most successful reproductive strategy. The Yasa hadn't just controlled women for psychological satisfaction. It had engineered a genetic takeover that succeeded beyond its creator's imagination. The four ordos, those carefully managed cities of women, served as more than symbols of power. They functioned as biological factories, producing children who carried predetermined advantages in societies that valued bloodline legitimacy. Every wife who entered those camps became part of a reproductive machine that operated with industrial efficiency. Modern fertility clinics studied the historical records with professional interest. The Khan's administrators had solved logistical problems that contemporary medicine still struggled with. Tracking ovulation cycles across hundreds of women, maximizing reproductive opportunities, maintaining genetic records without modern technology, the systematic approach anticipated scientific methods by centuries. But the hardest questions remained unanswered because they lived in the silence between statistics. 16 million descendants meant millions of women whose names never made it into records. Each genetic marker represented a moment of human suffering, transformed into biological success. The numbers told one story. The unrecorded experiences told another. Population geneticists developed new models to track the expansion patterns. The initial spread followed conquest routes, concentrated in garrison towns and administrative centers. Secondary expansions came through trade routes as the Khan's descendants leveraged their bloodline for commercial advantage. Tertiary waves spread through marriage alliances that valued genetic connections to power. The discovery forced uncomfortable recognitions about human nature and power. Modern democracies prided themselves on equality and human rights, yet their populations carried genetic proof of history's most successful authoritarian breeding program. The chromosomes didn't care about contemporary values. They simply replicated, generation after generation, following patterns established by trauma and law. Medical researchers found unexpected benefits in the genetic concentration. Certain hereditary conditions appeared with predictable frequency in populations with high marker rates. The massive sample size allowed studies impossible with normal genetic diversity. The Khan's legacy inadvertently contributed to modern medicine through the sheer volume of his reproduction. Each new study refined the numbers upward. Improved testing methods found markers in populations previously thought unconnected. The genetic empire expanded with each technological advance, revealing connections that paper records had never captured. What started as historical curiosity became a fundamental fact of human biodiversity. The most recent estimates suggested even larger impacts. As global populations intermarried and migrated, The genetic legacy spread beyond its original boundaries. Descendants appeared in the Americas, Australia, Africa. The chromosomes achieved true global reach, carried by immigrants who often had no knowledge of their genetic heritage. Scientists calculated probability curves that staggered the imagination. In certain regions, random meetings between strangers carried 20% chances of shared descent from the Khan. Dating apps in Central Asia added genetic testing features to avoid accidental incest. The medieval breeding program created modern social challenges no one could have anticipated. The numbers painted one picture, clear and clinical. 16 million direct male descendants, 500 million total descendants, 800 years of exponential growth. But behind those statistics lived the systematic transformation of women into breeding stock, the calculated use of rape as reproductive strategy, the engineering of genetic dominance through traumatic control. This was Genghis Khan's true monument, not the conquered cities or shattered armies, but the chromosomes threading through humanity's genome. He'd built an empire that conquered from inside human cells, spreading with each generation, achieving immortality through volume rather than memory. The Yasa had worked exactly as designed, transforming personal trauma into species-wide genetic legacy. The final calculations suggested something even more disturbing. Given current growth rates and global intermarriage patterns, within another few centuries, the majority of humans might carry some genetic connection to this singular historic figure. His DNA would achieve universal reach through simple mathematics and time. The numbers told one story, but the human cost behind closed doors was about to explode. The messenger's horn shattered the pre-dawn quiet like a blade through silk. Guards converged on the northern sector, where Urgadai's mother maintained her household, their boots hammering frozen earth in perfect synchronization. Something had broken the night's routine, something that demanded immediate response from men trained to expect the worst. Inside the central command Ger, 3 administrators hunched over their record scrolls, candle wax dripping onto lists of names and infractions. The senior scribe's stylus paused mid-stroke as footsteps approached. Heavy ones, moving with purpose that meant either urgent news or imminent execution. In the Khan's household, both arrived without warning. The guard captain entered without ceremony, his face carved from decades of delivering bad news to powerful men. Behind him, 2 soldiers dragged a figure whose silk robes had been torn in struggle. A Naiman general named Belgute, one of the Khan's most trusted commanders. His wife followed, held between 2 female guards, her elaborate headdress askew and silver ornaments scattered across her disheveled clothing. Dawn hadn't yet touched the eastern mountains when the drums began their verdict rhythm. Not the morning call to prayer or the signal for camp movement, but the specific pattern that meant only one thing. The Yasa had been broken, someone would die today. The discovery had been almost accidental, a guard checking on unusual sounds from a storage ger, finding more than grain sacks and preserved meat. The embracing figures hadn't even heard his approach, too lost in their forbidden moment to notice death entering on leather-soled boots. Protocol demanded immediate arrest, immediate reporting, immediate consequences that would ripple through 500 households before the sun reached its peak. Word spread faster than mounted messengers could carry it. Women pressed against the walls of their gers, counting the drum beats that would determine which law had been violated. 7 beats meant theft. 12 meant conspiracy. But the steady 16-beat pattern echoing across the valley meant only one crime carried weight this morning. Someone had touched what belonged to the Khan. In the eastern sector, Berta listened to the drums while her servants pretended not to notice her hands trembling. 23 years of managing this world, and the sound still made her remember her own captivity. Each execution brought back the morning they'd dragged her from the Merkid camp, the way freedom and imprisonment had blurred into something unrecognizable. The tribunal assembled with rehearsed efficiency in the central square between the 4 ordos, not a formal court with arguments and evidence, but a demonstration of inevitable consequences. The Khan emerged from his mobile fortress already dressed in the black dell reserved for pronouncing death sentences. His face showed less emotion than the wooden masks worn by shamans during funeral rites. Belgute had fought in every major campaign since the unification. His scars mapped the empire's expansion across his body like a geographical survey. His wife came from noble Naiman stock, given in marriage to cement an alliance that helped secure the Western territories. Together, they represented exactly the kind of stability the Yasa existed to protect. The general's voice cracked as he spoke the ritual words of confession, not because he hoped for mercy, but because the script demanded acknowledgement before sentence. His wife said nothing, her silence more damning than any words. They'd been discovered in her cousin's ger, a meeting that started as family comfort and ended with the guard's intervention. Around the square, hundreds of eyes watched from designated viewing areas. The Khan's other wives stood in ranked sections, their faces carefully neutral while internally calculating how this would shift household dynamics. Belgute's death would leave territories needing new commanders. His wife's execution would create openings in the Naiman section's hierarchy. The stakes already waited, driven deep into ground that had absorbed similar scenes too many times to count. Hemp ropes lay coiled beside them, measured to ensure the condemned would strangle slowly enough to serve as instruction. The executioners stood patient as monuments, their craft refined through repetition until efficiency replaced any human response to their work. Genghis Khan's pronouncement came in the flat tone of someone reading a supply list. The crime, the violation of Section 12, subsection 4 of the marriage codes. The sentence, death by strangulation for both parties. The time, immediately. No appeals existed in a system where law replaced judgment. The crowd's composition told its own story about the Yasa's reach. Mongol warriors who'd laughed at death in battle flinched as the condemned were bound to their stakes. Chinese scribes who'd served sophisticated courts clutched their writing materials with white knuckles. Islamic teachers who preached about Allah's mercy watched their theological certainties crumble against the reality of absolute earthly power. A young wife in the Tangut section fainted when the executioners began their work. The woman beside her didn't move to help, knowing that excessive sympathy might mark her as harboring similar intentions. Throughout the crowd, women calculated the safest response. Too much emotion suggested dangerous empathy. Too little might imply defiance. The knife's edge of survival required perfect balance. The general died first, his warrior's strength making the process longer than anyone preferred. His wife followed, her smaller frame providing less resistance to the rope's pressure. The drums maintained their rhythm throughout, marking time until both bodies hung motionless in the morning light that finally crept across the mountains. But the executions were only the beginning of the Yasa's response. Guards had already surrounded the gers of both families, cataloguing possessions and relationships. The general's other wives would be redistributed according to inheritance law. His children faced immediate relocation to prevent clan-based revenge. Every connection between the dead pair required investigation and potential severing. In the command ger, administrators updated their scrolls with practiced efficiency. 2 names moved from active to deceased columns, property distributions calculated, guard rotations adjusted to cover the general's former responsibilities. The machinery of control ground forward, transforming human tragedy into administrative procedure. The Khan remained at the execution site longer than usual, his presence ensuring everyone understood the morning's lesson. His own household wasn't exempt from the law. Trust earned through decades of service meant nothing against statutory violation. The Yasa protected order itself, not individuals who threatened it through weakness. Conversations died in gers throughout the camp as women processed what they'd witnessed. A decorated general, hero of 50 battles, reduced to meat on a stake because of a moment's passion. His wife, mother of 3 sons who'd ride in future campaigns, strangled for seeking comfort in familiar arms. The arithmetic was simple and terrifying. The female guards reported unusual quiet during their rounds that day. Normal camp sounds, the gossip and laughter and complaints that created human texture, had been replaced by something closer to held breath. Women moved between gers only when absolutely necessary, their paths tracked by multiple sets of eyes, ensuring no suspicious meetings occurred. In the Karaite section, two sisters who'd grown up sharing everything now avoided each other's company, afraid their closeness might be misinterpreted. A Uyghur princess cancelled her weekly tea with wives from her homeland, deciding isolation was safer than any appearance of conspiracy. Throughout the four ordos, the morning's executions severed connections that might have offered comfort against captivity. The children's quarters reflected their mother's terror in miniature. Boys who usually practiced wrestling and archery sat silent in their lessons. Girls learning traditional weaving worked their looms without the usual chatter. Even infants seemed to cry less, as if absorbing the atmosphere of controlled fear that settled over the camp like winter fog. By noon, 3 more violations had been reported. A guard accused of lingering too long outside a widow's ger, 2 wives caught exchanging letters without proper authorization, a serving woman who'd smiled at a married warrior during morning food distribution. Each accusation triggered investigations that might end at the stake, depending on what the interrogators discovered or invented. The Yasa fed on fear, growing stronger with each reported infraction. Women who'd found ways to maintain sanity through small rebellions or secret friendships now turned informant to protect themselves. The morning's executions had reminded everyone that survival meant absolute compliance, that the law reached everywhere, that even trusted generals could find themselves strangling at dawn. In her private ger, Berta recorded the day's events in the administrative log that would outlive them all. Her stylus moved steadily across prepared hide, transforming horror into history. 2 names added to the death rolls. Several families requiring reorganization, guard rotations adjusted. Just another day maintaining order in an empire built from calculated terror. The general's stake would stand for 7 days as reminder and warning. His wife's body would hang beside him, their decay marking time until the next violation demanded fresh examples. The Khan's justice didn't end with death. It lingered in rot and stench, ensuring nobody forgot the price of breaking rules written in shadow and enforced in blood. That evening, the mobile fortress rolled through darkness between the ordos as always, but the guards noticed new tension in faces that peered through tent flaps. The execution of a trusted general had shifted something fundamental in the camp's ecosystem. If someone who'd ridden with the Khan since the beginning could die for a moment's weakness, then nobody was safe. The terror had always existed, woven through daily life like thread through cloth, but sometimes it required fresh blood to remind everyone of its presence. Today's executions would echo through the camp for months, maybe years. Every forbidden glance would carry the general's death rattle. Every private meeting would taste of hemp rope and mourning drums. In the northern section, administrators prepared for tomorrow's redistributions. The general's wives needed new households, his possessions required allocation, his responsibilities demanded replacement. The Yasa had torn a hole in the camp's fabric that would be patched with human lives rearranged like furniture. But worse was coming. The next violation would be different. It would happen in his own tent, and the discovery would transform the Khan's controlled world into something even his absolute law couldn't predict. The footsteps came at the wrong hour, not the measured tread of scheduled guard rotations or the shuffling gait of servants emptying waste buckets. These moved with purpose through the maze of tents, leather soles whispering secrets to packed earth while the rest of the camp slept. Genghis Khan's senior administrator, Yelu Chukai, had developed instincts sharper than any blade during his years managing the domestic empire. He tracked those footsteps from his administrative ger, fingers pausing over supply ledgers. The sound originated from the Khan's personal quarters and moved toward the adjacent tent reserved for his youngest Karaite wife. Something shifted in the darkness between buildings, a shadow where shadows shouldn't exist at this hour. The Chinese advisor set down his brush with deliberate care. 20 years of surviving this world had taught him when curiosity meant death and when ignorance proved fatal. He documented hundreds of executions, tracked thousands of infractions, maintained order through mathematics and terror. His ledgers contained every authorized movement within the 4 ordos. These footsteps weren't authorized. The night air carried other sounds now. Silk rustling against silk, A door flap moving too quietly, as if someone practiced at stealth had forgotten that absolute silence attracted more attention than normal noise. Then came the softest gasp, quickly muffled, from the Karaite girl's tent. Yelu Chukai made his choice. His own movements followed protocols written in blood rather than ink. 3 steps to the guard post, 4 words to the duty captain. Watch the administrator's face drain of color as implications crystallized. The captain's hand trembled, reaching for his horn. "Wait," Yelu Chukai commanded. His mind raced through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. Premature alarm might warn the violators. Delayed response could implicate the guards. The Yasa demanded immediate action, but also absolute certainty. They approached the Karaite tent like hunters stalking wounded prey. 2 guards flanked the entrance while others surrounded the structure. The captain's fingers wrapped around his sword hilt. Everyone understood that what they discovered would reshape the morning, possibly their lives, certainly someone's death. The door flap parted under the captain's careful hand. Inside, shapes moved in darkness that betrayed everything the law protected. The Karaite wife, barely 17 summers old, given to the Khan just 3 moons ago. But the figure beside her wore armor that caught moonlight through the smoke hole. Not just any warrior, one of the Khan's own sons. Time crystallized into heartbeats that lasted forever. The young woman saw them first. Her scream died unborn as training kicked in. The man turned, his face a map of recognition and doom. Prince Jochi, eldest son, the one whose questionable parentage had haunted him since birth, now caught in the one act that would confirm every whispered doubt about his blood. "My lord," the captain's voice cracked. He'd prepared for many discoveries, but not this. Jochi rose with the dignity of someone already dead. No protests, no explanations. His hand moved away from his sword, understanding that resistance would only multiply the tragedy. The Karaite girl pulled silk robes around herself, her movements automatic while her mind processed the algebra of disaster. "Send for my father," Jochi said simply. The horns sounded different this time. Not the steady rhythm of standard infractions, but sharp, staccato bursts that meant crisis within the Khan's own bloodline. Guards materialized from darkness. Administrators stumbled from their tents, clutching record scrolls. The machinery of control lurched into motion with the specific horror reserved for threats from within. Genghis Khan arrived before the echoes died. No mobile fortress this time. He'd ridden directly from the western Ordo, his horse lathered with sweat. Behind him came his other sons, Chagatai's face carved from satisfaction, Urgadai trying to appear sober, young Tolui watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. The evidence required no explanation. Jochi stood beside the Karaite girl, both under guard, both understanding the mathematics of their situation. The Khan's youngest wife, his eldest son. The Yasa made no exceptions for blood. "Bring them to the square," Genghis Khan commanded. His voice carried nothing. No rage, no sorrow. Just the flat tone of someone reading names from a casualty list. The guards moved to comply, but something shifted in Jochi's stance. For the first time in his life, the eldest son looked directly at his father. "I am your blood," Jochi said. The words carried weight beyond their simplicity. "The law is absolute." The Khan's response came automatic as breathing. For all people, in all circumstances. Between them hung 24 years of unspoken questions, the pregnancy that couldn't have been the Khan's, the birth during Berta's captivity, the doubts that poisoned every achievement, every victory, every moment of pride between father and possibly not son. "Then I ask for the trial," Jochi said. Silence swallowed the night. The Yasa permitted trials for disputed crimes, but not for those discovered in progress. Yet how could there be discovery when the crime was still unfolding? The Karaite girl hadn't spoken. No physical evidence existed yet, just presence and proximity and guards who'd seen shapes in darkness. Chagatai stepped forward. "The law is clear." "The law permits trial when facts remain uncertain," Tolui interrupted, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "We have proximity. We lack proof of consummation." Brothers faced each other across ground that might soon taste blood. Chagatai, secure in his parentage, eager to see doubts about Jochi confirmed through execution. Tolui, youngest but sharpest, understanding that this moment would define the empire's future. Ogede swayed slightly, wine making him bold enough to speak. Let them face the ordeal, he suggested. The Khan studied his sons. 4 paths diverging from a single moment. Execute Jochi and confirm every whisper about tainted blood. Grant trial and risk the law's authority. The Kerit girl stood forgotten between them, her fate secondary to the dynasty's crisis. Dawn approached like a predator. Soon the camp would wake. 500 women would learn that even the Khan's sons weren't safe from the Yasa. Or they'd discover that blood provided exemptions after all. Either lesson would reshape the careful balance of terror that kept order. Secure them separately, Genghis Khan decided. Summon the full tribunal. We follow the law completely. Guards moved to comply, while administrators scrambled for precedents. A son of the Khan facing trial hadn't been contemplated in the written codes. The Yasa covered every imaginable violation except this one, where the lawgiver's blood stood accused. The Kerit girl finally spoke. I confess. Everyone froze. Confession meant immediate execution, no trial needed. But her next words shattered that simplicity. I confess to seeking comfort from my isolation. I confess to speaking with the prince about my homeland. I confess to nothing the Yasa forbids between a woman and her husband's son. Technicalities within technicalities. The law forbade private meetings but didn't define privacy. It punished physical contact, but she claimed only conversation. Her confession admitted everything while denying the capital elements. She lies to protect, Chagatai began. She confesses to protect herself. Yeluchukai interrupted, surprising everyone with his intervention. A false confession of capital crime equals the crime itself. She gains nothing through deception. The administrator had served the Khan long enough to read the deeper currents. This wasn't just about one midnight violation. This was about succession, about legitimacy, about whether Jochi's questionable birth would finally provide excuse for removal. The Kerit girl had become a game piece in struggles that predated her birth. More horns sounded across the valley. The camp stirred like a kicked anthill. Women peered through tent flaps. Guards doubled their patrols. Everyone understood that sunrise would bring spectacle beyond the usual executions. The tribunal convenes at dawn, Genghis Khan announced. Full assembly. Every administrator, every judge. We will demonstrate that the law encompasses all. He turned without looking at Jochi again. The other sons followed, Chagatai's satisfaction visible even in darkness, Ogede stumbling slightly, Tolui maintaining his watchful silence. Only Jochi remained, still under guard, still maintaining the dignity of the already condemned. My lord, the captain asked, where should we secure them? The preparation tents, came the answer. The same structures where condemned prisoners spent their final hours. Separately, under full watch, no visitors. The Kerit girl moved first, her training in submission serving her even now. She walked between guards with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to survive through compliance. Jochi followed, his warrior's stride unbroken despite chains that would soon bind him. Yeluchukai watched them disappear into custody. His mind calculated rapidly. The trial would become theatre, its outcome predetermined by politics rather than evidence. But the Khan had chosen performance over summary execution. That meant something. Perhaps fear that executing Jochi would confirm the illegitimacy questions. Perhaps recognition that the law required at least the appearance of justice. Administrators rushed past, carrying armloads of legal scrolls. The tribunal would need precedents, procedures, the proper forms for trying the Khan's blood. They'd work until dawn, creating frameworks for a trial everyone understood was mere formality. In her ger, Berta sat alone with knowledge that dawn would bring either vindication or devastation. Her eldest son faced death for touching another woman. The irony cut deeper than any blade. She'd been taken, violated, returned pregnant. Now Jochi would die for seeking what had been forced upon her. Unless the Khan had other plans, unless this trial served purposes beyond justice. The preparation tent stood isolated at the camp's edge, far enough that screams wouldn't disturb the ordos' peace. Guards formed triple rings around them. Inside, Jochi and the carrot girl waited in separate structures for Dawn's performance. But Dawn would bring more than just a trial. The night still held hours of darkness, and in those hours, other footsteps moved through shadows. The Yasa had been violated once already. Before sunrise, guards would discover that Jochi's crime was merely the first tremor of an earthquake about to reshape the Khan's world of absolute control. By dawn, everyone would understand that behind closed doors, there was no mercy. The silence that followed Jochi's departure was broken only by wind rattling the tent walls. Yelu Chuchai returned to his administrative ger, but his hands wouldn't steady enough to hold a brush. 20 years of recording executions hadn't prepared him for documenting the death of the Khan's own blood. Across the camp, whispers spread faster than fire through dry grass. Women who'd survived by never speaking above breaths now found themselves unable to stop the words tumbling out. A son touching his father's wife, the eldest breaking the ultimate law. Each repetition added details that hadn't existed, transforming witnessed shadows into elaborate betrayals. The preparation tents glowed with extra torches, their light creating a bubble of brightness against the pre-dawn dark. Inside one, Jochi sat cross-legged on packed earth, his warrior's training keeping his spine straight despite the weight pressing down. The guards watched him with the fascination of men seeing a legend transform into meat. In the adjacent tent, the Karaite girl knelt with perfect stillness. 17 years of life, 3 months of marriage to the world's most powerful man, and now these final hours before dawn brought whatever justice the Khan's theatre would provide. Her confession had bought time, nothing more. Technical arguments about conversation versus consummation would dissolve under political necessity. The sound of horses arriving in darkness meant the tribunal assembled early. Judges pulled from their beds, administrators clutching hastily gathered scrolls, witnesses who'd rather be anywhere else. They filed into the great judgment ger that squatted between the 4 ordos like a spider at the center of its web. Inside, servants arranged cushions in precise hierarchies, while scribes prepared their recording materials. Every trial required documentation, but this one would need special care. Future generations would study these records, looking for signs of favoritism or weakness in how the Khan handled his own son's violation. Berta arrived without ceremony, taking her designated place among the senior wives. Her face showed nothing, but guards noticed how her fingers twisted the prayer beads she carried. 24 years since her rescue, and now she'd watched the child born from that captivity face execution for seeking what had been forced upon her. The other sons took their positions according to birth order. Chagatai's satisfaction had hardened into something colder, the look of someone watching a rival's destruction unfold perfectly. Ogadai had sobered enough to understand the stakes, his usual joviality replaced by careful neutrality. Tolui sat apart, those young eyes tracking every movement while his mind calculated futures. Outside, the camp held its breath. 500 women understood that this trial would establish new precedents. If the Khan's son could die for the law, then truly no one was safe. But if blood earned exceptions, then the Yasa's absolute nature would crack, creating fissures others might exploit. The drummers took their positions as eastern sky lightened from black to grey. Not execution drums yet, but the formal patterns that announced high justice. Each beat echoed across the valley, summoning witnesses who'd rather have slept through this particular dawn. Administrators compared scrolls by lamplight, seeking precedents that didn't exist. The Yasa covered every imaginable crime except this specific one, a possibly illegitimate son touching his father's newest wife. The law's silence on the matter created space for interpretation that would be filled by politics rather than justice. "Bring the accused," someone commanded. Guards marched Jochi in first, his chains creating their own rhythm against the formal drums. He'd changed nothing about his appearance, meeting his fate in the same armor he'd worn during discovery. The crowd parted as he passed, some averting their eyes while others stared at the condemned prince. The Karaite girl followed, her silk robes replaced by the plain dell worn by those facing judgment. Without cosmetics or ornaments, she looked even younger, a child caught in machinery that ground dynasties into dust. Her guards kept precise distance, close enough to prevent escape but far enough to avoid any suggestion of improper contact. They stood before the assembled tribunal as dawn light crept through the jurors' smoke hole. Behind them, the crowd packed in according to rank. Warriors, administrators, senior wives, all arranged in patterns that reflected the empire's structure. At the center, an empty cushion waited for the Khan himself. The trial couldn't begin without him, but Genghis Khan let them wait. Let them feel time's weight. Let them understand that even urgent justice bent to his schedule. The silence stretched until people shifted nervously, wondering if this delay meant something beyond theatrical timing. Finally, he entered with measured steps. No rushing, no visible emotion, just the careful movement of someone who understood that every gesture would be interpreted and remembered. He wore the black dell of judgment, its severity making him look carved from shadow. "We are here to determine truth," he began without preamble. His voice carried to the hair's furthest corners. "The law demands justice. Justice requires certainty. We will establish both." Yelu Chukai stood to present the charges. His normally steady voice cracked slightly as he read from prepared scrolls. Discovery in the Karaite tent. Proximity suggesting intimacy. The violation of Section 12 regarding contact between the Khan's wives and other men. Each word dropped into silence like stones into still water. "The accused may speak," the Khan announced. Jochi straightened, meeting his father's eyes for perhaps the last time. "I acknowledge entering the tent. I acknowledge speaking with the woman. I acknowledge that my presence violated protocols." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Acknowledgement without confession. Admission without accepting the capital elements. The same technical defense the girl had attempted, but from someone whose blood should have made such games unnecessary. Why? The Khan's question cut through legal technicalities. For a moment, something human flickered across Jochi's face. Then his expression returned to stone. "I sought understanding of the Western territories through someone who knew them." The conversation exceeded proper boundaries. Truth wrapped in deception, or deception disguised as truth. The tribunal would need to decide, but everyone understood the real question wasn't about midnight conversations. It was about whether Jochi's questionable parentage finally provided excuse for removal. The Karaite girl spoke without being asked. "I confirm the prince's words. We discussed my homeland. Nothing more occurred." Their stories aligned too perfectly, suggesting either truth or careful coordination. But in the Khan's justice system, perfect alignment often meant conspiracy. The very precision of their defense made it suspect. "Bring the discovering guards," someone ordered. The captain who'd made the discovery stepped forward, his career and possibly life hanging on his testimony. He described footsteps in darkness, shadows moving between tents, the moment of discovery when door flap parted. His words painted pictures without confirming the crucial detail. Had he actually witnessed physical contact? Under questioning, gaps appeared. Shapes in darkness might have been standing or reclining. Proximity didn't prove intimacy. The technical violations were clear, but capital crime required more certainty than shadows and assumptions. The guard captain sweated through his armor as interrogators pressed for details he couldn't provide. Behind it all lurked the unspoken question poisoning everything. Was Jochi even the Khan's true son? If Berta had conceived during Merkid captivity, then this wasn't really a son touching his father's wife. It was an outsider violating the Khan's property. The distinction mattered in ways that would reshape succession. Chagatai rose to speak, his words carefully chosen. "The law makes no exceptions for blood. If we permit technicalities to override clear intent, we invite chaos." His argument sounded reasonable, but everyone heard the deeper message. Remove Jochi now, while justification existed. Tolui countered with equal precision. The law demands certainty for capital punishment. Shadows and assumptions don't meet that standard. If we execute based on proximity alone, we criminalize every necessary interaction within the camps. Brothers arguing law while really debating inheritance. The tribunal had become a succession crisis wrapped in judicial procedure. Every word carried double meanings that would echo through generations. Ogedei attempted to find middle ground, perhaps punishment short of execution, exile, loss of position. The law permits gradations when certainty remains unclear. Compromise that satisfied no one but might prevent immediate bloodshed. The Khan listened to his son's debate, his face revealing nothing about which argument swayed him. This was their test too, showing how they'd handle power when it passed to them. The Karit girl's family had no voice here. Her father commanded thousands in the Western Territories, but his daughter's fate would be decided by strangers arguing technicalities. She stood perfectly still, understanding that her life had become currency in transactions beyond her control. More witnesses appeared. Guards who'd seen Jochi near the Karit section on previous nights. Servants who'd noticed glances that lingered too long. Each testimony added weight, without providing the certainty capital punishment required. Patterns suggested intention, but the Yasa demanded proof. Hours passed as arguments circled. The crowd grew restless. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, while inside the jur, shadows played across faces twisted by concentration and calculation. This wasn't justice anymore. It had become politics performed as legal theatre. Then Berta stood. The first wife rarely spoke at trials. Her movement created instant silence. She walked forward with the dignity of someone who'd survived 24 years in this world. When she stopped before her husband, their eyes met across decades of shared understanding. "I request the mother's privilege," she said simply. Ancient tradition, older than the Yasa itself. A mother could speak for her son in matters of life and death, but invoking it here raised the very question that haunted Jochi's existence. Did she have standing if he wasn't truly the Khan's blood? The silence stretched until it became physically painful. Genghis Khan's response would answer questions that had festered since Jochi's birth. Accept Berta's privilege and acknowledge him as true son. Reject it and confirm every whispered doubt. "Speak," the Khan said. One word that changed everything. Berta had standing. Jochi was acknowledged. The succession question that had poisoned decades dissolved in a single syllable. Chagatai's face went pale. Tolui nodded as if confirming a calculation. Ogedei exhaled relief. But Berta's next words surprised everyone. "I request trial by ordeal. Let the gods determine truth where human eyes see only shadows." Traditional step justice, the kind practiced before written laws and administrative procedures. Warriors would face physical tests. The gods would preserve the innocent and destroy the guilty. Simple, primitive, and absolutely binding. The Khan studied his wife. Trial by ordeal removed the decision from his hands. Whatever happened would be divine judgment, not paternal favoritism or political calculation. It was perhaps the only solution that preserved both the law's authority and the dynasty's stability. "What ordeal?" he asked. "The test of the white stone," Berta answered. "Sacred tradition where accused parties held superheated stones. Innocence meant healing. Guilt meant festering wounds that would prove deception." The Kerit girl's sharp intake of breath was the first emotion she'd shown. Jochi straightened further, understanding his mother had found the narrow path between execution and exoneration. Survival would require enduring agony. Death would come slowly if the burns festered. But it offered something the tribunal couldn't: clear resolution. "I accept," Jochi said before anyone could object. The Kerit girl's voice came smaller but steady. "I also accept." The Khan nodded once. "Prepare the ordeal. We reconvene when the stones are ready." The crowd filed out slowly, everyone understanding they'd witnessed something beyond a simple trial. The succession had been addressed. The law had been upheld through traditional means, and 2 lives now hung on whether heated stones would burn or bless. Guards escorted the accused back to preparation tents. Jochi walked steadier than before, knowing his parentage had finally been acknowledged even if his life remained forfeit. The girl moved like someone in a dream, her mind trying to process how conversation about homeland had led to superheated stones. But the real victors were those who'd orchestrated this solution. Berta had protected her son while respecting the law. The Khan had avoided choosing between dynasty and justice. The ordeal would provide resolution that human judgment couldn't achieve. As the tribunal dispersed, administrators scrambled to prepare for an ordeal that hadn't been used in decades. Sacred stones needed finding, shamans required summoning. The technical merger of ancient tradition with modern law demanded careful choreography. In the preparation tents, Jochi and the Karate girl waited for stones that would either prove their innocence or confirm their guilt through divine judgment. The dawn trial had ended without resolution. The noon ordeal would provide answers written in burned flesh and heaven's will. The camp returned to tense waiting. Women whispered about the mother's privilege and what it meant for succession. Guards doubled their vigilance, understanding that today's precedents would govern tomorrow's enforcement. Children absorbed lessons about law and family that would shape their understanding of justice. But in the administrative gare, Yelu Chukai made careful notes about something else entirely. The trial had revealed cracks in the system. The Yasa couldn't anticipate every situation. Traditional justice had been needed where modern law failed. The perfect system of control showed imperfection at its highest levels. Those cracks would widen with time. Today's ordeal would resolve Jochi's immediate crisis, but the questions it raised would outlive everyone present. Could absolute law govern human complexity? Did traditional wisdom sometimes surpass written statute? What happened when the lawgiver's own blood challenged the law? The stones were heating in sacred fires. Soon Jochi and the Karate girl would grasp them, letting divine judgment write its verdict in their flesh. But the real trial had already ended. The Khan's absolute control had bent to accommodate family, tradition, and political necessity. The Yasa remained absolute for everyone else. For the Khan's blood, exceptions could be carved from tradition and necessity. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone watching. Power made its own rules, even when those rules pretended to bind everyone equally. As noon approached with its promise of resolution through ordeal, the camp understood something fundamental had shifted. The machinery of control still functioned, but its gears had slipped, revealing human judgment beneath mechanical law. The ordeal would determine two fates. But the trial had already revealed the Empire's future. Absolute control was impossible when humanity kept breaking through, demanding exceptions, requiring wisdom beyond what any law could contain. The Khan had built a system to prevent chaos, only to discover that perfect order was its own form of chaos, brittle and waiting to shatter. The sacred stones glowed white-hot in bronze braziers, their surfaces shimmering with heat that warped the air above them. Shamans chanted in languages older than memory, while guards formed circles within circles around the judgment ground. The noon sun beat down on assembled witnesses who'd rather be anywhere else but couldn't look away from what was about to unfold. Jochi emerged from his preparation tent with burns already forming on his palms from practice stones. The shamans had allowed him to understand what was coming, to prepare his mind if not his flesh. Behind him, the Karite girl stumbled slightly, her legs barely supporting her weight after hours of prayer and fasting required by the ritual. The crowd parted as they approached the braziers. Warriors who'd seen men die in countless ways flinched at the thought of grasping superheated stone. Women pulled children closer, using their bodies to shield young eyes from what would happen next. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself held its breath. Genghis Khan sat on a raised platform, his face carved from shadow despite the midday sun. Beside him, Berta maintained her own mask of calm, while her fingers shredded prayer beads one by one. The other wives watched from designated areas, calculating how different outcomes would shift the camp's delicate hierarchies. The head shaman raised his staff, and drums began their ancient rhythm. Not the mechanical beat of execution drums, but something older, a pattern that reached into bones and blood. The sound pulled at something primal in every listener, awakening memories of when God spoke through fire and stone rather than written law. "The accused will step forward," the shaman intoned. Jochi moved first, his warrior's training keeping his stride steady despite what awaited. The Karaite girl followed on legs that wanted to run but had nowhere to go. They stood before the braziers as shamans explained the rules everyone already knew. Grasp the stones, hold them for the count of 9, display the burns for judgment. Simple instructions that meant agony beyond description. The preparation had taken 3 hours. Finding the right stones, smooth river rocks that wouldn't crumble under heat, building fires with sacred wood gathered under specific moon phases, summoning shamans from 3 different traditions to ensure no one could claim bias. Every detail mattered when divine judgment would write its verdict in human flesh. Assistants used iron tongs to lift the first stone from its brazier. The metal tools immediately began smoking where they touched the superheated rock. They placed it on a bronze plate before Jochi, its surface glowing like a fallen star. Heat radiated outward in waves that made nearby witnesses step back. "Prince Jochi," the shaman announced, "you stand accused of violating sacred law. If innocent, the stone will know. If guilty, the stone will mark you. Do you accept heaven's judgment?" "I accept," Jochi replied, his voice carried across the silent crowd. Somewhere in the back, a baby cried once before its mother muffled the sound. The Khan's expression never changed, but observers noticed how his knuckles whitened where they gripped his chair's arms. The second stone was placed before the Karaite girl. She swayed slightly, and for a moment it seemed she might faint. But something hardened in her expression, perhaps understanding that showing weakness now would be interpreted as guilt. She straightened her spine and faced the brazier. "Woman of the Karaite," the shaman continued, "you stand accused of betraying the Khan's trust. The stone will reveal truth where human eyes see only shadows. Do you accept heaven's judgment?" Her response came as a whisper that somehow carried to every ear. "I accept." The drums shifted rhythm, building towards something that made horses stamp nervously in their paddocks. Guards tightened grips on weapons they couldn't use here. Administrators clutched their recording materials, knowing they'd need to document whatever happened next in language that captured divine judgment without seeming to question it. "When I lower my staff," the shaman instructed, "you will grasp your stones. You will hold them for the count of 9. You will then display your palms for judgment. Begin." The staff descended like fate itself. Jochi's hands moved without hesitation. His fingers closed around the glowing stone with the same decisiveness he'd shown in battle. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then his face transformed as nervous system finally communicated what flesh was experiencing. The smell hit the crowd first. Burning meat mixed with something else, something that made primitive parts of human minds scream warnings. But Jochi held on, his jaw clenched so tight that observers could hear teeth grinding. His whole body shook with the effort of not releasing the stone. The Karaite girl's scream pierced the air before she even touched her stone, but her hands moved anyway, driven by will stronger than self-preservation. Her fingers wrapped around the glowing rock, and her scream transformed into something beyond human voice. Still, she held on. 1, the shaman counted. Time stretched like heated metal. Each number fell into air, thick with the smell of burning flesh and the sound of ragged breathing. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as skin bubbled and blackened where it met stone. Some turned away. Others leaned forward, needing to witness every moment. 2. Jochi's eyes rolled back, showing only white. His body wanted to collapse, but warrior's discipline kept him upright. The stone in his hands glowed like a piece of sun brought to earth. Blood began seeping between his fingers where skin split from the heat. 3. The Karaite girl's scream had died into whimpers that somehow seemed worse. Her whole body convulsed with each number, but her hands remained locked around the stone. Tears streamed down her face, evaporating before they reached her chin from the radiating heat. 4. A guard fainted, his armor clanging as he hit the ground. No one moved to help him. Every eye stayed fixed on the two figures enduring agony that would have broken most humans already. The drums maintained their rhythm, marking time in a world where seconds lasted hours. 5. Something changed in Jochi's posture. The shaking stopped. His eyes opened, focused on something beyond the physical world. Observers would later swear they saw light emanating from him, though whether from the stone or something else remained disputed. His breathing steadied even as flesh continued burning. 6. The girl's whimpers transformed into words. Ancient Keriot prayers her grandmother had taught her, syllables that predated any written language. The watching shamans exchanged glances, recognizing power in those words even if they didn't understand their meaning. 7. Blood now flowed freely from both sets of hands. It hissed and steamed where it met the stone's surface. The bronze plates beneath them began to warp from conducted heat. Still, neither released their grip, locked in an ordeal that had passed beyond simple endurance into something else entirely. 8. The Khan leaned forward for the first time. Whatever he saw in that moment would remain his secret, but witnesses noticed his expression shift, recognition of something. Understanding that went beyond simple guilt or innocence. Berta's prayer beads finally snapped, sending carved stones scattering across the platform. 9. Release the stones. Both stones dropped simultaneously, hitting bronze plates with sounds like temple bells. Jochi and the girl stood swaying, their ruined hands held before them. The crowd surged forward, before guards restored order. Everyone needed to see the burns that would determine life or death. The shamans approached with ceremonial care. They studied Jochi's palms first, conferring in whispers while blood dripped steadily onto packed earth. The burns were severe, flesh charred and blistered in patterns that would scar permanently, but beneath the damage, something else appeared. The stone has marked but not consumed, the head shaman announced. Heaven acknowledges transgression but finds the crime incomplete. The prince lives but carries heaven's warning in his flesh forever. Relief and disappointment rippled through different sections of the crowd. Jochi had passed the ordeal, but barely. The burns would heal into scars that marked him as someone who'd walked the edge of divine condemnation. Not innocent, but not guilty enough for death. The shamans turned to the Keriot girl. Her hands told a different story. The burns were severe but strangely uniform, as if the stone had carefully marked boundaries rather than consuming randomly. Ancient symbols appeared in the burn patterns, though whether by divine intervention or coincidence remained unclear. The stone finds no deception in her words, the shaman declared. Her hands bear heaven's seal of truth spoken under trial. She is freed from accusation. The girl collapsed as judgment was pronounced. Guards caught her before she hit the ground, careful not to touch her burned hands. Healers rushed forward with salves and bandages, beginning work that would take months to complete. Jochi remained standing through will alone. His eyes found his father's across the distance between them. Something passed in that look, understanding that transcended words. He had survived, but the ordeal had changed more than just his flesh. The burns would heal into reminders that even the Khan's blood walked beneath heaven's judgment. The ordeal is complete, Genghis Khan announced. His voice carried its usual iron, but observers detected something else beneath it. Heaven has spoken through stone and flesh. Let none question this judgment. The crowd began dispersing slowly, everyone processing what they'd witnessed. Divine judgment had provided the resolution human law couldn't achieve. Jochi would live but marked. The girl would survive but scarred. The succession questions remained technically unresolved, but practically answered through trial by fire. Healers led both survivors away for treatment that would last weeks. The sacred stones were returned to their repositories, their duty complete until heaven required their judgment again. Shamans began purification rituals to cleanse the ground of blood and burned flesh. But the real changes were invisible. Every person who'd watched the ordeal now understood that the Yasa's absolute nature could bend when tradition demanded. The Khan's own son had faced divine judgment and survived, creating precedent that would echo through generations. The system of absolute control had shown flexibility at its highest levels. Yeluchukai made his careful notes, documenting everything in language that captured facts without interpretation, but his private thoughts went unrecorded. The ordeal had revealed cracks in the empire's foundation. When written law failed, older powers had been invoked. When human judgment proved insufficient, heaven itself had been called to arbitrate. Those cracks would widen with time. Today's ordeal had resolved an immediate crisis while planting seeds of future challenges. If divine judgment could override the Yasa, what other authorities might claim similar power? If tradition could save the Khan's son, might it save others who found themselves trapped by absolute law? The four ordos returned to their routines, but something fundamental had shifted. Guards still patrolled with mechanical precision. Women still lived within boundaries defined by statute and fear. The machinery of control ground forward as before, yet everyone now knew that even absolute systems had limits, that heaven might intervene where human law overreached. In his tent, Jochi studied his ruined hands while healers worked. The scars would mark him forever as someone who'd touched forbidden things and survived heaven's judgment. Not innocent, never fully trusted again, but alive. His mother's gambit had saved him through tradition older than any written law. The Kherite girl lay in the medical tent, her hands wrapped in silk bandages soaked with precious healing oils. She'd spoken truth, and heaven had confirmed it, but truth hadn't prevented her hands from burning. Even divine vindication came with permanent consequences in the Khan's world. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the camp, life resumed its careful patterns. But the morning's execution of General Belgute and the noon ordeal of the Khan's son had created new rhythms within the old. Fear still governed, but now it was tempered by the knowledge that even absolute power had limits, that heaven watched and sometimes intervened. The real trial had ended not with the stone's judgment, but with what that judgment revealed. The empire built on absolute control had shown flexibility at its core. The Yasa remained supreme for ordinary people, but extraordinary circumstances might invoke older powers. The Khan had created a system to eliminate uncertainty, only to discover that certainty itself could become a cage requiring divine intervention to open. Tomorrow would bring new challenges to the system. Other wives might remember the Kherite girl's survival. Other sons might wonder if their own transgressions could find similar resolution. The ordeal had resolved one crisis while planting seeds for future ones. But those were tomorrow's concerns. Today, the camp processed what they'd witnessed. Heaven's direct intervention in earthly law. The stones had spoken. Flesh had burned. Truth had been revealed through agony. And somewhere in that ancient formula, the absolute nature of the Khan's control had bent just enough to accommodate human complexity. The burns would heal into scars. The scars would become reminders, and those reminders would whisper to future generations that even the most absolute human systems must sometimes yield to powers older and stranger than any law written by mortal hands. The ordeal was over, but its implications would outlive everyone who'd witnessed it, creating precedents and possibilities that would echo through an empire built on the promise that law was absolute, control was complete, and chaos could never again intrude. Today had proven that promise wrong. Chaos hadn't intruded from outside, but had emerged from within, from the Khan's own blood seeking forbidden comfort. The response had required reaching beyond written law to judgment written in stone and flesh and heaven's own fire.